Welcome, everybody, to the Dig Deeper broadcast. If you're joining us today, we encourage you just to share it out, invite someone to watch with you as you listen today. Jordan, your message was really awesome this week on Easter weekend, talking about extravagant generosity and intentional generosity. And I think this is something that God has kind of had a life lesson for us. So we've been married 20 years, and there's many times where God has asked us to give sometimes extravagantly and sometimes in a way that cost us a lot. It took a lot of faith to step out and do those actions. And so in our marriage, we share everything. We share bank accounts. We share all our money. There's no Jordan's money, Sonia's money. And we've always kind of had this concept that, whatever financial decision we make, we do it together. But we have this one thing when it comes to God speaking. So if God speaks to Jordan or God speaks to myself about being generous or sowing into something, we don't argue about those things. We listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. But I do know there's many times where I think it's gone both ways. There's times where God has spoken to Jordan and I didn't have faith for that situation. And there's times where God's spoken to me and he didn't feel very comfortable about it. When you look at this passage where you were talking this weekend, you see when Mary pours out this extravagant gift, everybody around her doesn't understand why she's doing it. And so sometimes when God asks us to do something extravagant, people won't understand it. They'll think you're crazy. So they thought she was crazy because she took a year's worth of wages and poured it out on Jesus's feet. Oh. And, sometimes when that happens, people can have judgment, or sometimes people can have this tremendous fear. And I know for myself, when sometimes God has asked us to give extravagantly, immediately this fear kind of comes, right? Like, am I going to have enough for what I need if I sow into this situation? And we see Judas, right? He's right away, he actually kind of sows this fear. His heart isn't clean on it. But he sows this fear, if we, that could have been used for the poor. Now, maybe we won't have enough money in our ministry purse to take care of the poor. And yeah, I don't know. I thought it would be a great conversation for those of you that are listening. How do you get over that fear of not having enough when God asks us to give?
When you're sharing that, I'm thinking like Judas vocalized probably what everyone else was feeling, right? Because the setting is everyone's at this dinner, they're honoring Jesus. Jesus is sitting there, he's reclining. You have all these spiritual people there. You have Lazarus, you have the disciples, you have even some Pharisees there. But no one celebrates this except for Jesus. Everyone else is kind of probably thinking the same thing Judas is saying, but Judas is so upset about it. He's so mad about it because he feels that this could have been diverted, and he uses the spiritual thing, which sounds very spiritual here. I was reading it out here, but he says this in verse 5, John 12, verse 5, he says, why wasn't this perfume sold for a high price and the money given to the poor? Why wasn't this perfume sold, right? And instead of being poured out, it's already
religious, but not really spiritual.
Yeah. But it sounds like yes. Why wasn't it? And I was thinking about that. Is that fear that can come in when God's prompting us to give? Mary probably had this, could have had this fear of what people were thinking, fear of, is she going to need this perfume later on to sell it? There's some of the needs that they would have. Is this really what God is speaking to her? But as she did it, and what was amazing about it was, I don't think, sometimes you read these commentaries and they said, well, she really knew what she was doing. I don't know if she really knew what she was doing, because sometimes we have no idea what we're doing when God asks us to give. We just think it's that money that we're being asked to give us, give that, whatever it is, $100 or whatever it is, $50, is give that money or give that item up. We actually sometimes have no idea what's going on behind the scenes, right? And so that fear can come in and really grip is about the future. And I think Reinhard Bonnke, one of the best quotes I've ever heard is, he said, fear always makes bad decisions. Fear always makes bad decisions. And there's so many times in his ministry that fear could have taken over. He told that one story of where he built this giant tent and $3 million to build this tent. And they'd only used it, I think it was like being used just for a couple months. Windstorm came through, tore the entire tent apart. $3 million gone. And it was put on all the front pages, everything. And that idea of like, what a waste, right? Like $3 million. But in God's eyes, it wasn't ways because God had spoken to him to do this. And I think that fear is when we allow those words of the enemy or the words of the flesh to come in and try to tell us that our future is going to be ruined or we're going to miss out on something in the future by making this decision, right? And so by her obeying and just saying, no, I'm going to pour it out, actually, it was a beautiful thing. It says that in the scriptures here that this story would be told for years on, is that as well as accompanying the gospel message, this story would be told. And so I think if we can get past that idea of just looking at our immediate need, looking at the future, not allowing the enemy to tell us that we're going to lack,
Yeah.
then we can kind of see like, no, God's got a greater plan for it. And God had a greater plan than just that perfume being poured out.
I remember in our early days of our marriage, we had just been married, I think maybe 2 years. And we were in a grocery store, and God told Jordan to give somebody a certain amount of the money that we had. And he didn't realize I was the budget keeper. The amount he asked me to give was actually equivalent to like our last $20. And I remember when he asked me, I said, no, we're not giving that because that money had to last us another week before we would get paid from our teaching job. And I remember he turned to me and he said, no, God has spoken to me that I need to give this and I will not disobey God. We need to give this amount of money.
It
And so
was,
I was so angry as a wife. I pulled out that it was in a different currency. It was 100 Chinese dollars. And I passed it to Jordan and I gave it so grudgingly, thinking, okay, God, now I have another week before we get paid. How am I going to buy food? How are we going to take our bus to work? Actually emptied our wallet. We didn't have any more
and I was
cash.
too young and we were newlyweds to realize what saying no to your wife would actually, what that could do. So I just didn't realize you just kind of just going for it.
But that night he turned to me and he said, your attitude is wrong. God is going to provide. And I started to say sorry to God, but I still had this like agitation and this fear inside of my heart. Well, ironically, the very next day I get a call from Canada and a family member, said that God had spoken to them and they were going to send us an offering that day. And that offering was more than 10 times what we had sown. And God just totally floored me because here I was thinking that I'd given my last dollar, and yet God, I just opened up. Jordan had opened up his hand. I didn't do it willingly. But God was just so faithful and he provided. And so he's still in the business of doing that today when we step out in faith, when we say, okay, yes to God, when he asks us to sow extravagantly. And I often find that sowing often comes in a place where actually we don't have a lot. So the times where God has really asked us as a couple to give big has been times where we actually didn't have it to sow. And it's been with that thought in our mind, okay, I'm giving this to you, God, but where is my bus money coming? Or where is my plane ticket back to my home country? Where is that coming from, God? And he has been so faithful every single time that
Yeah.
he's asked us to sow.
But I think fear is something that we have to keep battling, right? Because I think that this last season I've been in during the last year, it's like it feels like I've almost forgotten everything you've learned throughout the years, and you can almost return back to that same spot, right? To kind of relearn these lessons of trusting God, and it just brings when you think of Israel, right, when they left Egypt and they saw all these miracles, and you wonder how could they ever forget about God? It's actually really easy to forget the good things that God has done, the immediate things. And for Judas here, it's like he's not thinking about God could take loaves and fishes, right? But that's not in his mind that how God could multiply
He was
any,
actually
yeah,
stealing from the ministry account.
any
He
amount of
was
money, right? But the attitude there that if this is not used at this amount of time for this purpose, then it's that need's not going to be met, right? Or judging what someone else is doing, but it's not trusting the Lord. And so that fear issue is really saying is that God, when we're looking at this passage, is God is fear controlling me, right? Am I allowing fear to control my decisions when it comes to being generous, or am I allowing faith to really be the one and your voice to be the one that's guiding me, or is it the voice of fear?
Mary poured out this gift, and it sounds like it was something that was for a woman, right? She poured out this perfume. Can you think of an example? And if you're in the chat, you can share with us of a time where God brought a resource into your life, but it really wasn't for you. It was like he gave it to you for a season, and you knew after you had it that he'd given it to you for someone
Yeah.
else.
One of the words that stood out to me when he was doing this is that when Jesus said that it was for this purpose, right? is
Hmm.
that God had brought that perfume into Mary's life. It wasn't to be sold for the poor, even though that sounds spiritual. It wasn't to be used for a building. It wasn't to be used for any other purpose, any spiritual purpose you could think of. That wasn't the purpose. That wasn't the intention. Is that Jesus says the intention of that perfume was to be used to be poured
Hmm.
upon Jesus to prepare him for the burial. And he says it's a beautiful thing. And I think anyone else looking at that perfume would not have seen that's what that intention is for. And so I think thinking about in your life, these things that God brings into your life is that sometimes God will have us hold on to something, but it's like we're almost just like God's placing it in our hand, and then we're getting to be the one that gets to give it, right? It's like being, and if we can see ourselves as that rather than it's like this is mine and I'm now going to have to give it away, right? Seeing ourselves as someone that God gets to place in our hand, we get to give it away. And I think I've seen this time and time again where God will use us, where He blesses us with something or He gives us something, and it's ours for a season, but He really wants us to be the vessel that's used to bless someone else, to give it to someone else. And if He can trust us to be that, right? It's quite amazing if you think of that, is that if God can use you as a vehicle to be a blessing to someone, how much He can pour into your life, right? But think about like if you're being asked to, you're asking someone to carry money for you, and I've done this before where I've asked people to carry money overseas for a project or something, right? And I remember one time I didn't quite get there on time. I did get it eventually, but it was like I didn't really want to use that person anymore as someone to kind of pass funds through, right? Because I wasn't sure, is it going to make it there or is it going to make it there in a timely manner? Well, God wants to use us as a vehicle,
Mm.
as a person, as an instrument of blessing, where He can pour something into our life and give it away. And something that sometimes it's easy. I can remember like Pastor Don when he was leaving China, and we were working with him in China. Is that he had a vehicle and he left it, and he said, "Oh, it's the churches." Well, we had no idea how to drive a vehicle. We didn't know it was a. I think it was even like
Standard.
standard manual. We had no idea how to drive this vehicle at the time. We didn't really need this vehicle, and so I can remember it was so easy actually to take this because I didn't see it as ours. I didn't see it as something we even needed. Where other people could, well, this is worth a lot of money, or this. It was just so easy. I can remember we knew exactly who it was for, and we asked that individual to
They were
come,
so excited because
and
they had been praying for a
they've been praying for
vehicle.
a vehicle. They've been taking the city bus with all their kids over an hour to come to church. And I can remember we were there. We asked him to close his eyes and just open up like he was going to receive something. He had no idea, and then we dropped keys into his hands, right? And it was so easy because I didn't actually see it as something we needed or that was for us. And I think sometimes we hold on to things, and I know this has happened to me. It's like we
I
become,
might need it later.
yeah, that orphan kind of mentality where
Yeah.
it's like I need this, or I might hold this on, or I might use this later on, and we're not free to be
Yeah.
like, you know what, I don't need this, and God, if I do need in the future, you can bring it back to me, right? And you've talked about this before.
Yeah.
It's like praying for
Yeah.
things that we need, right?
Interesting enough, several years later, the church actually did need a vehicle. We were had a location where we didn't have storage, and we had to move equipment, worship equipment, guitars, every single week back and forth from the church location that we were renting. And I remember, like, we started to pray for it, and somebody, God gave them a dream, and in that dream, I had just had a baby, and they saw me rollerblading with the baby on my head, trying to get to church, and they said the Lord spoke to them that the church needed a vehicle, and so they gave a vehicle to the church. And so I really believe that we received that vehicle when we needed it because we sowed one when God asked us to. And so sometimes you can be sowing something into someone's life, and you're going to reap the benefit maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, and you're not giving it to get something back, but God sees that heart, and He sees that you're good soil, that He can trust you, that if you live a life where everything that you have is yours, God can take it at any time, but He also can pour back into you. And so that's a really powerful thing to understand in the area of extravagant generosity.
Yeah, and I think for Mary, this blessing, like I said, if she had waited till after Jesus died, she would have missed this opportunity because that perfume would never have been used for that purpose
Hmm.
because He wasn't staying in the grave. if she said, okay, I'll wait and then I'll use it later on, she would have missed the opportunity, right? And so there are times and there's seasons where God gives us an opportunity to sow at that time. And there are times where we've missed it. I think there's times where I've missed it, where I'm like, oh, I should have, I felt like you were telling me to do it, and I didn't want to do it because of the money, right? Because the cost, worried about what
Hmm.
that money would do. And later on, you don't even miss it. It's like the money goes to something else or goes to another expense, right? Or another bill comes up. And so I think trusting the Lord when He prompts us and speaks to us, that is the time to do it. Because for Mary, if she had waited till after Jesus died, she would have missed it. By the time she got to the tomb, He had already risen. He wasn't there anymore. Is that He was already alive. He didn't need to be prepared for burial any longer. He didn't need that perfume or those spices any longer because He had already risen from the dead. And so there's I think that principle there of like not allowing fear to control you, trusting God, being this vessel that you say, God, I'm going to live with an open hand. As you bring it in, I'll give it out, and really trusting the Lord. I think in this season, there's a real fear of lack,
Yeah, not
real
having
fear of
enough.
not having enough. And I felt it where I never had this before. Um, well, I would say for a long time over life, but it started to come back, this fear. And I think the fear is there to really to control us, to really get us
Hmm.
to be making decisions in the flesh rather than the spirit. And so I want to encourage you in the area of generosity, whatever God is prompting you to do. Maybe it seems like, God, I don't even understand. Like when you think of perfume upon Jesus' feet, a year's worth is like, this makes no sense at all, except in the spiritual realm of what God was telling Mary to do. That God knew what He wanted to do, and God knew this
It's
prophetic
perfect
sign. He
sign.
knew what it was to pour this perfume on Jesus' feet. Is that she probably had no idea what was going on, except to say, God, this is what you've put on my heart to do. And so I do want to encourage you, whatever God's speaking
Mm.
to us to do, it might seem out of the ordinary. It might seem, well, this is not like sometimes it's like, okay, it has to go into the church basket for it to count. No, if God is speaking to you to give to someone, maybe they even look like everything's going fine in their life, is that if God's speaking you do something, is do it, because you never know what that's speaking beyond the gift. I think
Yeah.
that's the one thing that I really was hearing is like there's times where people bless me and it's not the value of it. It's like it speaks beyond the value, right? That was very valuable, but nothing compared to what Jesus's blood, what the forgiveness of sins could do. What is a year's worth of wages when you talk about eternity, when you talk about guilt and shame, when you talk about the stress and the anxiety that is upon people because of the guilt of their sin and the shame, is that being freed up from that is like there's no earthly cost that you can make equivalent to that. And so I just want to encourage us is that just so, because you never know that significance of that gift and how God can use it far beyond that monetary value that you might think it's okay. I'm giving $100, I'm giving $20. Well, God might use that gift to speak volumes much louder than that $20. And for Jesus, this was speaking much louder than that year's worth of money or cost for that perfume. Is the significance of really what it was, is it was anointing Him to go to the cross, His death and His burial and His resurrection.
So thank you so much for joining us for the broadcast today. Join us again on Sunday as we worship together, and we hope you have an awesome week. God bless you.